Hello students, today we begin with yet another interesting chapter in history, Nazism and the rise of Hitler. In today's module, we will learn about the background for the rise of Nazism, mainly the First World War and its impact. Nazism as an ideology emerged in Germany, mainly as a result of the conditions created by the First World War and the economic crisis of 1923 and 1929. In this section, we will explore very briefly the First World War and its impact on Europe. We will also discuss how this Great War affected the economic and political setup of Germany, creating conditions for the rise of Hitler. The First World War. Well, the First World War was a global war which originated in Europe. It was fought from 28 July 1914 to 11th November 1918. The war drew in all the world's great economic powers, assembled in two opposing alliances. Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy had signed the Triple Alliance Treaty in 1882 and were known as the Central Powers. However, even though Italy was a member of this alliance, it ended its alliance with the Central Powers and entered the war in 1915, a year after it began, joining the Entente Powers. The other group, the Entente Powers, were Britain, France and Russia. These powers had signed a pact known as the Triple Entente in 1907. It was different from the Triple Alliance, as it was just an understanding of supporting each other and was not binding on its members. Italy justified its action of joining the war on behalf of the Entente countries by declaring that the alliance with the Central Powers was only a defensive, and the Central Powers had violated this rule by starting the war. As the war progressed, these alliances were reorganized and expanded. More and more nations entered the war. On one hand, we had Italy and Japan, who joined in support of the Allies, while on the other, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria joined in support of the Central Powers. The year 1917 proved to be a turning point in the course of the war. The United States joined the war in that year, while the Russian government withdrew from the war in the same year because of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the spring of 1918, the Allies drove back the Germans in a series of successful offensives, and on 4th November 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire agreed to an armistice. Germany, which was experiencing its own trouble with revolutionaries, also agreed to an armistice on 11th November 1918. So the Allies, strengthened by the US entry in the war in 1917, won, defeating Germany and the Central Powers. By the end of the war, the national borders were redrawn and several independent nations created. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 saw the victorious powers, that is Britain, France, the United States and Italy, imposing their terms on the defeated nations through a series of treaties. The League of Nations was also formed in 1919 with the sole aim of preventing another world war. Unfortunately, as we know, this effort failed, and the economic depression, a renewed upsurge of European nationalism, and the German feeling of humiliation contributed to the rise of Nazism. And all these conditions eventually contributed to the outbreak of yet another war, the Second World War. Let us now discuss the impact of the First World War on Europe. The war had a devastating impact on the entire continent in terms of the loss of life and property. It also brought a change in the outlook of the people, followed by changes in the political and economic organization. To discuss loss of lives, according to some sources, the total number of military and civilian casualties in the First World War was more than 38 million, over 17 million deaths and 20 million wounded, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. These included about 11 million military personnel and more than 7 million civilians. The Central Powers lost about 4 million military personnel, while the Allies lost about 6 million military personnel. In addition, at least 2 million died from disease and around 6 million went missing, presumed dead. Besides this, the war brought about malnutrition, epidemics, severe food shortages caused by the U-boat campaigns and the policy of blockade used by both sides to disrupt trade and to maximize damage. Let us now look at the psychological impact of the First World War. The First World War left a deep imprint on the European society and politics. Revolutionary changes occurred in social behavior as a result of the First World War. In fact, it completely changed the way people looked at life and developments. As the stories of the bravery of the soldiers spread, they came to be placed above the civilians. The men were expected to be stronger, aggressive, and brave, as these qualities were essential for a country's victory in the war. The media glorified trench life. Interestingly, a variety of new words and phrases also gained currency, like the term shell shock. It emerged in the harsh winters of 1914-1915, when soldiers tried to describe how they felt when under fire. The socialist and labor movements seized the opportunity to make considerable advances, as did communism and fascism, which also gained popularity. Aggressive war propaganda and national honor occupied center stage in the public sphere, and popular support grew for conservative dictatorships that had recently come into being. Democracy as an ideology was unable to survive the instabilities of the interwar Europe. Now let us talk about the impact of the war on the economy of Europe. The economic impact. The end of the war reduced the European countries to debt-ridden economies, vulnerable to the changes taking place in the West. From a continent of creditors, Europe turned into one of debtors. When the war began in 1914, all the countries expected it to end by Christmas. None had made any economic preparations for a long war, such as stockpiling food and necessary raw materials. The arranging of finance for the war was a challenge for all the powers. Since the Allies had larger and more versatile economies and also better access to global supplies, the extended war proved beneficial for them. Germany financed the Central Powers, while Britain financed the Allies till 1916. It was then that it ran out of money and had to borrow from the United States. In 1917, the US began giving loans to the Allies, which had to be repaid after the war. The victorious Allies looked to the defeated Germany in 1919 to pay reparations that would cover some of their costs. According to one estimate, the Allies spent about $147 billion on the war, and the Central Powers about $61 billion. The ammunition industries had to be built up to provide shells, guns, warships, uniforms, airplanes, and 100 other weapons, both old and new. Efforts had to be made to provide food for both civilians and for the soldiers. Horses were needed to move supplies. Transportation in general was a challenge, especially when Britain and Germany each tried to intercept merchant ships headed for the other side. These and many more expenses resulted in the European countries incurring huge debts by 1918. Thus, after the war, Europe became extremely weak economically. It also became vulnerable to external shock. The massive European debt during the 1920s was a direct result of the destruction caused by and the loans taken to pay for the war, which in turn caused the great economic collapse in Europe during the 1920s. While on the surface, the European economy somehow found some stability during the 1920s, the real issue of their economy was not addressed, resulting in the economic collapse of 1929, when the structural supports of the European economy came tumbling down. This was the prelude to one of the world's worst depressions in economic history. The war also had consequences for the European socialist and labour movements. By the end of the war in 1918, the socialist and trade union movements were much stronger than in 1914. Let us now discuss the impact of the First World War on Germany. 1. The defeat of Imperial Germany. During the war, there were political changes happening within Germany, like a socialist revolution. This was followed by communist activism in urban parts of the country, the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the creation of the Weimar Republic. Second, the abdication of the emperor. Wilhelm II was the last German emperor. He was the eldest grandchild of the British Queen Victoria and related to many monarchs and princes of Europe. Crowned in 1888, he supported Austria-Hungary in the crisis of July 1914 that led in a matter of days to the outbreak of the First World War. Unfortunately, he proved to be an inefficient ruler and an ineffective wartime leader. Therefore, he lost the support of the army and had to abdicate in November 1918. 3. Recasting of German polity or the birth of the Weimar Republic. The German state between 1919 and 1933 was referred to as the Weimar Republic. The name was derived from the city of Weimar, where its constitutional assembly first met and drafted a new constitution which established a democratic state with a federal structure. The new constitution was adopted on 11th August 1919 and accordingly deputies were elected to the Reichstag or the German parliament. This was based on universal adult franchise including women. In its 14 years, the Weimar Republic faced various problems such as rising prices, political radicalism. In addition, it had problems of negotiation with the victorious powers in the First World War. Unfortunately, the Weimar Republic was blamed not only for the country's defeat, but also for the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles. However, the Weimar Republic, the Weimar government successfully reformed the currency, unified tax policies and also organized the railway system. Let us look at political radicalism. Inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution which had transformed Russia in 1917, the Spartacus League attempted a revolutionary uprising on the same pattern in Germany in 1918. It was a Marxist revolutionary movement named after Spartacus, the leader of the largest slave rebellion of the Roman Republic. Soviets of workers and sailors were established in many cities. The political atmosphere in Berlin was charged with the demands for a Soviet-style government. The Socialists, Democrats and Catholics were opposed to this, and they met in Weimar to give shape to a democratic republic. The uprising was crushed by the Weimar Republic with the help of a war veterans organization called the Free Corps. The Spartacists later founded the Communist Party of Germany. As a result, communists and socialists could not reconcile their differences and could not join hands against Hitler. There was a general perception for radical solutions to restore German pride. The Treaty of Versailles. The peace treaty signed at Versailles ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers. It was signed on 28 June 1919. Exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. separate treaties were signed with Central Powers by the Allies. The terms of peace treaties were harsh and humiliating. Germany and her allies were made to accept the responsibilities for the war and also had to own up the losses and damages caused by it. This later was known as the War Guilt Clause. According to the terms of the treaty at Versailles, Germany lost its colonies such as Togoland and Cameroon in Africa. It also lost 13% of its territories such as Alsace and Lorraine to France, and its iron and coal deposits to France, Poland, Denmark and Lithuania. Germany was also demilitarized by the Allies. According to the War Guilt Clause, Germany was held responsible for the war and the damages. She was forced to pay war compensation which amounted to a whopping £6 billion. Rhineland was occupied by the Allied armies. The new Weimar Republic was held responsible for not only the defeat in the war, but the humiliating terms of the treaty signed at Versailles. Thus, the Weimar Republic was held responsible for the sins of actually the old empire. The Republic was crippled financially by being forced to pay war compensation. The Weimar Republic was supported by socialists, Catholics and Democrats, and thus were attacked by the conservative nationalists. They were given the name of November criminals. Let us now look at the economic impact of the war on Germany. Hyperinflation, or the economic crisis of 1923. Political radicalization was only heightened in Germany by the economic crisis of 1923. Germany had fought the war largely on loans and had to pay war reparations in gold. This depleted the gold reserves at a time when resources already were scarce. In 1923, Germany refused to pay and the French occupied its leading industrial area, Ruhr, to claim the coal. Germany hit back by printing paper currency recklessly, resulting in the devaluation of the German currency, that is the mark. The prices of goods increased and the value of the mark collapsed. This resulted in hyperinflation, a situation where prices soar up. Thus, students, it was common to see Germans carrying cartloads of currency notes to buy one loaf of bread. To solve the German crisis, the Americans introduced the Dawes Plan. This changed the terms of the treaty regarding the war reparations and thereby reduced slightly the financial burden on the Germans. According to the plan, Ruhr was returned to Germans and huge loans were given to her to combat the crisis. So what did we study today? We observed that the First World War divided the countries of Europe into two blocks, which proved to be disastrous in the long run. The destruction caused by the war and the humiliating and unfair terms of peace paved the way for growing political discontent and an economic crisis, which ultimately will result in the popularity of Nazism and the rise of Hitler. In our next lecture, we will discuss the economic crisis of 1929, its effects on USA and Germany. Thank you.